in Middle Eastern history from Tel Aviv University, and in English literature from Middlebury College. She freelances as a writer and editor.
Hi, I'm also very happy to be here to celebrate the publication of Uriya's books. I was also one of his master's degree students. Sorry. Okay. My master's thesis was on, yes? How's that? Better? Okay. All right. Height sometimes has its disadvantages. I'm originally from Minnesota, and I noticed that there was quite a difference in the population of Minnesota in my time growing up there. This was partly due to an influx of refugees. So I'm going to talk briefly about Somali refugees in Minnesota. Somalis refugees in the United States are one of the largest refugee populations in the United States. 1 in 3 Somalis in the United States lives in Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota. Okay. I'm going to paint the picture in broad strokes of what Somalis are like in Minnesota, but I'd like to point out a few individuals. First, if you've seen the movie Captain Phillips, one Somali Minnesotan, Barkhad Abdi, starred alongside Tom Hanks. Kadra Mohammed became Minnesota's first female Somali police officer. You see she's also wearing a hijab. There are only 2 police departments in the United States that allow their police officers to wear a hijab. One is in Minnesota, the other one is Washington, D.C. Although she has to wear pants, which is a bit of a controversy in her community. There are some prominent intellectuals, like Professor Ahmed Samatar at Malacaster College in Minnesota, and there are the radicals. Abdirazak Warsami was the 10th man charged just this last December by the FBI for providing support to the Islamic State. In the spring of 2014, a group of at least 11 young Somali men from the Minnesota community began conspiring to join the Islamic State. 1 managed to make it there. The other 10 have since been arrested by the FBI. 3 have pled guilty, and the others are going on trial next year. A little background on Somali Islamic practice. They are 95% Sunni Muslim. In Somalia, prior to the 1990s, to be a Somali Muslim was basically to belong to a Sufi brotherhood. Practice was very flexible and integrated with customary traditions. They venerated their ancestors. They visited Sufi shrines, grave sites. Somalis speak Somali. They don't speak or read Arabic as a rule, and there was very little knowledge of what was actually written in the Quran, written in the Hadith. Like the rest of the Islamic world, they became part of the Islamic revival, starting in the 1960s when Somalia received independence from Britain and Italy. Some young men started studying abroad in Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula, learning Arabic, learning what the Quran actually said, and bringing that back. But they were suppressed under the government of the dictator General Sayed Barre, who sought a socialist society under his dictatorship. So only after Sayed Barre was kicked out in 1991, in the 1990s, did these Islamic movements start to take off and to gain more followers. In these movements, there was an attempt to return to true Islam, as they put it, and a greater veneration of the texts, as well as a rising religious conservatism, which you can see in Somali practice in the diaspora as well. The Somali refugee crisis was spurred by the ousting of the dictator Barre in 1991, and since then it's been a failed state, 25 years of civil war. The UNHCR estimates as of last year that at least 1 million Somalis have registered as refugees through them, but there are 2 million Somalis that are internally displaced. This is the number of Somalis between 1990 and 2012 that the United States officially accepted. These are refugees that were vetted through the UNHCR. So you can see each year, in 2002, there was a dip because that was immediately after September 11th, and the U.S. didn't accept many refugees at all in that year, but they made up for it in subsequent years. In total, in those years, the U.S. accepted about 100,000 Somali refugees, 17,000 of which were sent directly to Minnesota. Why Minnesota is in the Midwest, dead center in the United States. It borders Canada. It's quite cold. And its population at the time that it started accepting refugees was actually in decline. People were moving out, not moving in. And it happens to have some major industry there. For example, General Mills is based there, 3M, which manufactures Scotch tape, and so on. The total population of Minnesota is 5.3 million, most of which is concentrated in the cities. You can see there in the red. Minneapolis and St. Paul are the two major cities, the Twin Cities. And most Somalis are residents in those cities. The census estimates put the Somali population at 37,000 in Minnesota, but Somalis themselves estimated it as being much higher. The problem is that it's all self-reporting. Somalis don't have to say that they're from Somalia when they fill out the census. Why Minnesota? Basically because Minnesota said that they could take them. They had the money and they had the resources. They had a series of voluntary agencies that agreed to take in refugees and provide them with English classes, housing, driver's licenses, and so on. When a refugee comes to the United States, they're on the path to citizenship. They get a green card within a year. They can start working within that year. Minnesota has strong social services. It's known as a socialist state in the United States. And among Somalis, there was a perception that Minnesotans were less racist towards them, less racist towards Muslims, less racist towards Africans in general. This brought about a strong secondary migration movement within the United States. Somalis who'd been placed elsewhere, say Texas, would then decide to move to Minnesota because they heard that the conditions were better there. Somalis comprise about 60% of Minnesota's Muslim population. Of the foreign-born population aged 25 and older, so 45% speak little to no English, 57% do not have a high school education, partly due to the breakdown in social institutions in Somalia. Of the general Minnesota population, the Somali unemployment rate is 3 times the rate of the general Minnesota unemployment rate, and 80% live at or below the U.S. poverty line. This is not because they don't want to work, but because integration into the society and finding those jobs when you don't speak English is not so easy. They've built a life for themselves in Minnesota. In the last 10 years, they've founded many mosques. In Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, just in those 2 cities, there are 36 mosques and 41 Islamic cultural centers, by my counting. It's not official. Half of them are Somali-run, since 60% of the population is Somali. They've established an annual Somali Independence Day parade on the streets of Minneapolis. They opened the Somali Museum of Minnesota, in which they're trying to save cultural artifacts, which are being destroyed in Somalia itself. And they've also opened Somali malls catering to the Somali population, halal restaurants, and many, many community centers. One last thing I wanted to mention is that the mosques have become very strong in the diaspora in a way that they weren't in Somalia itself. This is partly due to this perception that the mosques are helping the young Somali people maintain their Muslim as well as their Somali identity. As one of my interviewees said, the mosques had programs, and any mother whose son went to the mosque to learn the Somali culture and cultural norms was proud. They became strong in the absence of American institutions in our community, meaning that before Americans had set up cultural centers and so on, the mosques were already there to provide some support for the community. Now, there is some radicalization in the community as well, not just with the Islamic State, but earlier in 2007, 23 young Somali men, these are second-generation men, they might have been born in Somalia, but they have no memory of it in most cases, decided that they would go back to Somalia and join al-Shabaab in the fight to create an Islamic State there, an Islamic Caliphate, I should say. Some of them realized that they'd made a mistake and came back and are now serving time in prison. Some of them were killed, and others are still missing. Most of the radicalization seems to have occurred in a couple of particular mosques. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about rising conservatism in the community, which can be seen in 2 specific cases that I studied. I was looking at whether or not the Somalis were more interested in approaching internal local sources of religious authority or external sources like the internet, whether they were conforming to Somali social expectations of what it was to be a Muslim, or whether they were trying to forge an independent path informed by their own personal readings in scripture, and whether they were choosing more conservative and rigid forms of practice over more flexible and integrative forms. And basically, I found that they tend to stay in their internal community to consult local Somali imams in particular, conform to Somali social expectations, although they are also trying to do their own personal readings, and that they see more conservative opinions as being safer. Even if the opinion might not be correct 100%, they want to stay on the safe side, so they're going to be a little bit more conservative in the way that they practice. So one of my cases was to look at the phenomenon of hijab wearing among Somali women. As one of my interviewees said, culturally in Somalia we did have hijab, but we didn't have this type, the big hijab, a specific kind that was worn by Somalis in Minnesota. I don't know if you've seen the Somali cultural clothing. It's nothing like this stuff. So here's the Somali traditional clothing. This kind of clothing kept the woman's arms bare, or at least was very loose, and allowed her to work in a nomadic society where women also had to work with the animals and the children, so on and so forth. The headscarf that the woman on the left is wearing is a sign that she's married. It's not actually a hijab. It doesn't conform to the requirements of hijab. And the one to the right, I don't believe she's wearing a headscarf at all. This was the usual case until the late 1990s, early 2000s. Now women in the diaspora are wearing these big hijabs. Since the 1960s, there's been a resurgence in headscarf wearing across the Islamic world that is part of the Islamic revival, the spread of Islamism in particular. In 1991 in Somalia, the convergence of the political and social instability and the rise of these Islamist groups within Somalia brought about a change in the clothing almost overnight. The change is very abrupt, according to the people that I spoke to. In the refugee camps in particular, women's need for safety, stability, a feeling of protection, some outward symbol that they were good Muslim women caused them to start veiling. They also had a desire to practice true Islam due to the belief that perhaps it was Somalia's negligent practices that had caused the troubles in Somalia in the first place. The bigger the hijab, the more pious the woman, is what they believed. And there was great pressure to veil in the diaspora as well to protect their Somalian Muslim identity. Okay. These are women in Minnesota in 2011. These are young, unmarried women, all wearing the same type of hijab. Okay. The other issue, these women, by the way, they started wearing hijab at very young ages, as young as 2, and partly because their parents wanted them to start experiencing this identity as early as possible in the diaspora. Okay. The other issue that I studied was the 2006 taxi driver fatwa, as I call it, in response to the question of what is the ruling of carrying alcohol or wine as a taxi driver. This started with one man asking a question of a Somali imam in 1999. He was told verbally not to take passengers that were carrying alcohol because it would be assisting them in sin. He started pressuring his friends to follow the verbal fatwa that he'd received, and despite the fact that they lost money, they lost fares due to refusing to take these passengers, this phenomenon started to take off amongst Somali taxi drivers. Somali taxi drivers are 75% of all drivers in the Twin Cities, meaning that there are approximately 600 of them. The Metropolitan Airports Commission, which is in charge of the taxi drivers at the airports where most of these refusals were occurring, documented from 2002 to 2006 that 5,400 ride refusals were committed by drivers, and so they felt the need to step in and start to process, come to some kind of agreement with the drivers. The drivers asserted that they should not be required to transport passengers with alcohol, as to do so would go against their religious conscience. They invoked the U.S. Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits employers from discriminating against employees on the basis of religion and other factors, and they said that this would be an infringement on their religious freedom in the U.S. And indeed, the Airports Commission wished to accommodate them initially because they were afraid of legal action. During one of the meetings between the taxi drivers and the Airports Commission, the drivers brought in religious advisors in the form of 4 imams representing an organization called the Muslim American Society of Minnesota. The driver said, if these scholars give us permission to take passengers carrying alcohol, we'll do it no problem. However, the Airports Commission was handed a fatwa that had been written down, which is unusual in the community, translated into English, and the fatwa said, among other things, all Muslim scholars agree that carrying and drinking alcohol is prohibited according to Islamic jurisprudence. This is based on a hadith that is classed as sound. Based on that, it is not permissible for you to carry on working in this job because it involves cooperating in sin according to the Islam. An emphasis was placed on carrying the alcohol, not on carrying passengers, which was a problem that came up later. And the imams added a compromise. They advised the drivers that they could continue in this job as long as they just didn't take these passengers. And they told the Airports Commission that they should just put a top light on all of the cars that would refuse to take passengers as a way to signal to people that this taxi they can't take, but this other one they can if they have alcohol. The Airports Commission initially agreed to do this, but there was a very negative backlash once the issue hit the media. This cartoon says, American Islamist taxi, Sharia, which is ruled by Sharia, and the taxi driver is saying, you can't bring that in my cab. That's Uncle Sam, representation of the United States, carrying the US Constitution. So the Airports Commission was accused of allowing conservative imams to impose Sharia law on American citizens. They received hundreds of complaints. Passengers started falsely claiming that they were carrying alcohol in order to provoke a response from the taxi drivers. Islamic organizations around the world tended to be negative as well, emphasizing that the driver's contract was with the public and not with alcohol. In addition, some of the drivers privately told the Airports Commission that they didn't need accommodation, but rather to be forced, not to bear responsibility for their situation. This was apparently in reference to a line in the Quran which says, he who is not forced without desire or intention, he who is forced without desire or intention will not sin. Okay. In response to this outcry, another group of scholars in Minnesota issued a counter fatwa. Their fatwa said that called on all taxi drivers to transport all customers regardless of what they carry and who they're with. They said that intent was the issue, that the purpose of the ride is to transport the person, not the alcohol. And they invoked the concept of maslaha, that is, what best serves the public interest in Islam. And as some of you may be familiar with, what I saw here was a conflict between two different groups, the Salafi and Wasati interpretations of Islamic law, and two different ways of approaching the situation of Muslim minorities living in the West. The outcome of this was that in 2007, the Airports Commission voted to increase penalties on taxi drivers for refusal of passenger fares for any reason other than fear of safety. And in 2016, the drivers are still driving. There have been very few issues, and the number of drivers has actually grown since, but many of them are still upset about the whole issue. In conclusion, I'd like to say that there's been a rise in religious conservatism in the community, fueled by the Islamic movements abroad, the continued instability in the homeland, and especially by peer pressure to keep one's Somali and Muslim identity strong while living in a non-Muslim majority country. Thank you.
Thank you very much.